Okay, perfect. So now we are live, and I would like to welcome everyone behind their screens. I'm very happy to officially open the third out of our four speaker series, this time on the topic of racism, anti-racism in a digital world. Please let me shortly introduce the project. The speaker series is part of the Thinkathon online challenge number 2, the last action of the 2-year project, Our Digital Future CEC, a European, Canadian, Youth Transatlantic Civil Society Dialogue. The project is granted by the EU Commission and realized by the Goethe Institut Montreal, Think Young, and Carrefour Jeunesse Emploi Notre-Dame-de-Grâce. My name is Annalena Grünagel, and I'm the project manager at the Goethe Institut in Montreal. Through a series of actions, the aim of the project is to connect European and Canadian youth and youth organizations, as well as policymakers, to address challenges and opportunities of the digital world. The specific objectives of this project are to foster people-to-people contacts and exchange of views between young Canadians and Europeans, aged between 18 and 30, on the key parameters required to ensure that our digital future is inclusive. Second, to enable young Canadians and Europeans to jointly contribute to policymaking on a digital inclusive future. And third, to increase public awareness and initiate a broad public discussion in Canada as well as in Europe. As mentioned at the beginning, our last action is the Thinkathon online challenge number 2, where over 250 teams composed out of 600 young adults from Europe and Canada signed up to work on a policy recommendation on how to make their digital future inclusive, focusing on the topics of racism, anti-racism, health, education, climate change, and gender equality. 50 teams made it into the second round and are now fine-tuning their recommendations. This speaker series is intended to offer food for thought to our participants, but also to animate the public getting involved and exchanging thoughts. So please feel free to ask your questions to our panel in the comments you see below the live stream. Please let me thank the European Union for their financial support in order to realize this project, as well as our main partner, Agorize, and all our promotion partners in Canada and Europe. I would also like to thank our speakers for their commitment and engagement in the topic. Racism, anti-racism. This led a lot of discussions in 2020, but shouldn't it always be a top priority? How can we learn about hidden racism in the digital age? And what actions to fight against it? How can policy recommendations support anti-racism? These are only a few questions that are on top of my head. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. So please let me introduce our moderator, Mohamed Amjahid, who will guide you through the discussion. I'm sorry, Mohamed, that I missed your name. Mohamed was born as the son of so-called guest workers in Frankfurt am Main in Germany. He attended school in Morocco and studied political science in Berlin and Cairo, and conducted research on various anthropological projects in North Africa. During his studies, he worked as a journalist for Taz, Frankfurter Rundschau, and Deutschlandfunk. He's currently working on several new book projects and won several awards in the category of investigation. So please, Mohamed.
Thank you so much, Annalena. Thank you for hosting our talk today. We want to discuss the question, how can we fight against racism in a digital age? Again, to the audience, if you have any questions, any remarks, please feel free to just comment wherever you're watching us. I would like to introduce our amazing guests today and then kickstart the conversation because we have only 60 minutes. So I'm happy to welcome Samira Rafaela. She is a politician of the Social Liberal Party, D66. She has been serving as a member of the European Parliament since 2019. She's a member of the Committee on International Trade and the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality. Also, she co-chairs the European Parliament Anti-Racism and Diversity Intergroup. Chris Reiner has been the executive director of the Canadian Youth Secretariat for more than 3 years. He comes from the Department of Indigenous Services, where he was Director General of the Education Branch. Prior to this, he held a variety of executive positions within Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, including in relation to Indigenous governance and capacity development. Juliana Santos Walgreen is a senior advocacy officer at the European Network Against Racism, where she is working now for almost 15 years. Her areas of work are migration, anti-Semitism, and national action plans against racism all over Europe. She previously worked as a legal counselor for ASTI, Association de soutien aux travailleurs immigrés in Luxembourg, and as a lawyer in Brazil. And Jacques Odenigbo, he is a Black French Canadian from Calgary, Alberta, who is incredibly passionate about the interactions between culture, health, and the environment. This passion manifests itself in his role as founding director for Future Ancestor Services, an Indigenous and Black-owned youth-led professional services social enterprise and startup that advances climate justice and equity with a lens of anti-racism and ancestral accountability. I can't wait so you can tell us more about that. He's also co-founder of the Poison and the Apple, a nonprofit organization that seeks to change the way in which Canadians interact with nature. And on top, he is a PhD candidate in medical geography. Well, welcome to all of you. And my first question to Chuck, I just had a talk with the Charmaine Nelson. She's an amazing Black professor in art history and worked for years at McGill University. And while we were talking, she was describing to me her frustration with something very specific. At one hand, daily racism that a Black person, an Indigenous person, lives in Canada. And on the other hand, an image that Canada has as a very inclusive place where basically everybody is happy and there is no such thing like discrimination. I don't know how you would comment on that from your perspective and your experience.
Guten Abend, bon après-midi tout le monde. So Canada's a really interesting country in the sense that, we're one of the few countries in the world that has multiculturalism sort of integrated into our charter. It's sort of integrated into the fabric of our country, as we'd like to say. But that doesn't negate Canada's history. So Canada has a very powerful history of white supremacy, of Anglophone supremacy. So there's a lot of different very fascinating intersections of supremacies that Canada has had. We were definitely not the first country to allow women to vote. We were one of the last countries to allow women to vote. We were not the pioneers in anything gay rights, but we were relatively early compared to a lot of other countries. But essentially, we're one of those really interesting countries where we have a very powerful history of white supremacy. We've got a not well-known history of slavery, of indentured servitude, of internment camps, of cultural genocide, and of actual genocide against the peoples that aren't very well known because we also are right next to the USA and they tend to get a lot of the spotlight. And so when you're next to a country that gets a lot of spotlight, you tend to sort of be able to sit back in the shadows. And so Canadians are also known as being very sort of practical. We're not necessarily the type who, things are changing slightly, but we tend not to be the type who make a fuss about things if we can let it slide and like sort of move on. And so what that effectively tends to mean is we advocated for tolerance of multiculturalism for many, many decades. Mm-hmm. And so that after today is this tolerance of everyone and so this tolerance of people being different. But tolerance is not equivalent to acceptance. And so when you have tolerance, what that effectively means is, yes, we have this beautiful, multicultural, diverse country where there's so many different people who live here and who are able to sort of blossom here in very different ways. But that doesn't negate the barriers that all of these different people face because of their identities. And so to sort of speak to the Black professor that you spoke with, as a Black person in Canada, there are things that I don't necessarily worry about per se, but it's not impact me that are a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more, how do I put it? A little bit more death by 1,000 cuts versus death by a gunshot, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how Canada is a little bit, is if you are not sort of your atypical cis heterosexual white man, the history of this country has not been favorable to you. And so you live in a country where tolerance has been advocated for your existence, but tolerance is not acceptance. And there are lots of spaces where you're reminded of that. And when you're reminded of that, it's often in subtle, nuanced ways that are hard to openly complain about. And then when you do complain about it, you either hear, oh, it's worse in the US if you're speaking in English, or you hear, oh, it's worse in France if you're speaking French.
Yeah. It's always the comparison.
Always a comparison. And maybe it's better, maybe it is. But when it's kind of, as I say, like if you're in a math class, you don't compare yourself to the worst student in the class and go, man, doing so well compared to that kid who's getting a D. You look at the students who are doing better than you. Or if you're at the top of the class, you seek to keep on doing better regardless. You're not complacent in being mediocre. And so I think sometimes when it comes to discussing issues of racism in Canada, we tend to take this backseat of being okay with being mediocre because we're like, oh, we're better than our neighbor and we're better than France. So that's how it should function, right?
Yeah. Thank you, Chuck. I will let Chris comment in a second. First, I would love to hear Samira Rafaela's thoughts, because I asked my friends, which is not representative, of course, my Black friends and friends of color, about how they think about the European Union fighting against racism. And the image was not so good compared now to the Canadian image. Most people told me that the European Union is not doing a lot for racialized minorities. So why do you think, Samira Rafaela, people in the European Union don't have that positive image when it comes to defending minority rights all over Europe?
Yes, thank you very much, and good evening to you all. Very good that we're having this discussion. Well, I think it has to do with several things. Look, first of all, I can strongly imagine that the lack of representation, the lack of diversity within the EU institutions is definitely not helping for people to believe that their voices are taken into account in legislation and policies. That has a serious impact. That is not only, I believe, a feeling that I have. That is evidence based. I mean, if you don't have enough diversity, diverse backgrounds, diverse perspectives taken into account in every institution, in every organization, in every political party, then you cannot make the very best out of it. Then you cannot guarantee that the legislation and the policies that you produce are targeting specific communities with specific issues and challenges in life. So I believe that observation is true, and I also believe that that's evidence-based. There's a lot of documenting and researches about the negative consequences of a lack of representation and lack of diversity. And then the second thing is that I think that the recent years, and I'm also part of that, and unfortunately not too many, but luckily you see also now representatives, democratic representatives coming in the EU that, well, specifically the European Parliament, that are very vocal on the topics on discrimination and racism, also because of their own background. I can speak for myself. I know what racism is. I know what discrimination is. And that is why I find it very important to be very vocal and active on the topic. And that, of course, helps when you bring in this kind of diversity. Then that will slightly help. But I do agree that we need a more stronger critical mass. Because the balance is still not right, I believe, also in my own institution, the European Parliament. And that is why you get the observation, that is why you get the feeling with people that they feel like we don't find it important. But look, this year was a very, very, I believe, important and influential year. Unfortunately, we needed to have this very tragic, terrible happening with George Floyd. who died because of police violence, and that is very tragic. That we need this kind of situations to become, I would say, woke, like really to really wake up people and to really shake up our institutions when it comes to what exactly is happening with racism in our society. And that happened this year. The European Commission recently launched its anti-racism action plan. That was definitely because of the push, also because of the push coming from the European Parliament, also my own intergroup RD. We have also been working closely with ENAR, also concerning resolutions, but that was not only this year, also the years before my mandate. For example, organizations as ENAR were strongly involved. And this year we also voted through a new resolution on racism because of the happenings in the USA. And then the European Commission came with its own anti-racism action plan. So it's I believe this year that you can see a significant change, I believe, a change of approach coming from the EU. And now it takes some time, of course, to see what it means in practice. So the action plan also said that the member states, for example, need to deliver their own national action plan. The European Commission will monitor it also. And this action plan needs to be created with local representatives, with civil society. And they will also monitor how the member states have been implementing the Equality Directive. And if they did not comply to that correctly, then even infringement procedures can happen. So, so I believe that this year has been very influential. I definitely agree that we are very late. And I have said that pretty much, I believe, in every plenary debate that I had on this topic. We are very late. And it should have been solved yesterday. It should have been solved years ago. But let's see what happens now. I believe there's a significant change coming.
Thank you, Samira. Knowing that also, for example, police violence is something which is not only existing in the US, it's something that you can find in all member states.
Definitely.
In the European Union, also in Canada. Regarding the action plan from the European Commission, maybe we will later in a second hear Juliana's perspective on that. First, I would love to hear Chris Reiner's perspective. Do you work from an official side on anti-racism actually? Do you understand the frustration of so many racialized minorities in Canada when also they talk about what the government actually does or does in a mostly not so effective way, as some say?
Absolutely. So I work with the Youth Secretariat. There are a series of secretariats, the Anti-Racism Secretariat that I work very closely with, and the LGBTQ Secretariat as well. I just wanted to reflect a little bit on some of the words that Chuck had said at the beginning, because history matters. And here I am speaking to all of you from the traditional territory of the Algonquin people, their unceded territory, and that matters. It matters because it explains a relationship that continues in some form today. And I remember my journey is a little bit, when I was 16, I had a summer job up in Northern Ontario. It was the first time I set foot on a First Nations reserve. And I was shocked. I was shocked at the conditions, the lack of running water, the lack of facilities, the lack of opportunity for people. And it was kind of the beginning of an awakening. And that mattered to me because that was not what I was learning in school. That was not what was taught in the curriculum. That is not anything that you would have gathered from at that time what was being talked about in the news. And you had to go to experience it, and not many Canadians have still to this date. The history matters because it also establishes systems and structures that many of which live on in some form today. So we can talk about structural racism and ingrained processes that we need to continue to deconstruct and build new institutions and approaches in that way. But I think for the conversation here today too, it matters because we're talking about a new era of digitization and online platforms and the opportunity that presents. So, there are supports and structures necessary to help communities that have been historically disadvantaged for generations and generations, decades and centuries, that require some additional leg up to be able to just be at the same opportunity scale as many other people, whether in Canada, Europe, or other places around the world. So there is hope. And the hope is that in the recognizing where we have come from and what that means for the structures and the steps that we need to take in the future.
Thank you, Chris. So two important things. Samira already mentioned representation, and this is more about participation, also using new forms of communication. Juliana, Samira said that the problem should have been tackled like yesterday. We had a couple of days ago in Germany a committee from the government discussing anti-racist policies. The whole committee was white. There was a big discussion about that, but something is happening also apparently in Brussels. Are you happy with this?
First of all, thank you for the invitation and for being here and exchanging and learning also from you. I'm not say that I'm happy, and I don't think I will always be happy because racism is the norm. So we are not here trying to understand if we are removing racism and this is no longer the norm. We are just trying to find solutions to still live in a racist society while being racialized minorities. So I would never be satisfied from that point of view. However, I welcome the idea that this needs to start from somewhere. And I welcome as well the empathy of the institutions to take a stock of the reality, to take not only George Floyd, but also COVID as a mirror that highlights and the exacerbation of structural inequalities. It comes probably too late, but it's necessary. It's not perfect, but it's the beginning of something. And like MP Samira Rafaela mentioned, the most important thing is really this collaboration between institutions, and therefore the representation of minorities in the parliament is really important to ensure that the commission will be accountable to the same message that the parliament wants to bring to a more societal level. And it's the parliament is the most colored institution of the EU. Only with, if I'm not wrong, and Samira can correct me, I think we are only 31 people of color as MP out of 750 something in the parliament, and it's still the most colored institution. So, which is quite striking. So I think we have to understand that where we are now is just a piece of a very important process, and we need to progress. What I can say it's quite revealing was that on the EU anti-racist plan, there is acknowledged first of structural racism, institutional racism. There is the acknowledgement of the historic abuse, slave trade, and these are things that we need a place, we need a document that acknowledge that as part of history. Samira comes from the Netherlands, and it's very important, for example, that we say that in an European document in order to tackle Black Pete in Belgium, in the Netherlands. This is instrumental to this shift. What I also appreciate is the effort to bring probably for the first time a potential new legislation to combat police brutality. We will not see many legislations in the world where this is the case. I would like to hear also from the Canadian side, if you do have an instrument or a protocol, like a legal framework to combat police brutality. And here's an advance. Again, frameworks and implementation are two different different stuff, but we have to begin from somewhere. And I also like the idea, and I welcome the idea of the evolution of the sophisticated understanding of racism. 20 years ago, when we had the first EU action plan to combat discrimination and racism, it was still very focused on the level of the individual, so discrimination between individuals, and we never would mention that structural racism exists. 20 years after, we are here recognizing systemic discrimination and making a plan with funds to combat that. So the need, when they appoint, when they bring us to this, when they claim that this needs to be done with the purpose to demonstrate racial equality through all the policy package with an intersectional approach, we see that all the effort that we have put there before George Floyd happened, because we were already alarming that the situation was quite alarming. There were reports not done only by us, but also from the institutions from the European Union. There were people who killed by police brutality over the years. I think you are from Germany, you know, one of the biggest foundation in Germany was founded in the aftermath of Antonio Amadeu Stiftung was done in the aftermath of the first hate crime in Germany, recognized as such. So I think it's we have this data, but what we do with that? And I think for the first time there is an effort, but I will never be satisfied until we don't have the same demographic of people that are the demographic of the society in the European Union, sitting in the European Parliament and the European Commission. I think Brussels is so white, and we need really to bring more representation and participation to the table of the institutions.
Thank you. We have first questions from the audience. Are there any good institutional practices the EU could learn from Canada when it comes to tackling racial discriminations? That's a question from Julia Crumière. I mean, I said Canada has a big, good image, positive image. So what could we learn from Canada? Go ahead.
So actually, let me hop in on this one. So from what the conversation that has sort of been happening thus far, we're hearing a lot of talk about representation and the importance of diversity. And so those are conversations that we're seeing happening in Canada a lot as well, because we see a lot of sort of diversity at lower levels. And then as we get to sort of higher levels of society, whether we're looking in private companies or in the public sector as well, we see less and less sort of that diversity. And so it also brings up questions surrounding conversations about tokenism, for example. Someone is racialized, especially after what has happened with sort of George Floyd. A lot of organizations, both private and public, have turned to their sort of racialized staff members and asked them to sort of lead efforts to become more inclusive in that organization. And even as people who've gone through racism, that doesn't even fully understand racism. Right, that's a subject you need to sort of educate yourself on. It's a subject you need to study. It's a subject you need to learn about. I'm constantly learning things all the time, and I work in this field as a racialized person. And so there's this really terrible habit we have of taking data and taking numbers and trying to use numbers as a way of moving forward and as a way of justifying policy. And the irony of that is it's not holistic. It doesn't. It's a stopgap measure, essentially. It's a way of saying, okay, we recognize that we don't have enough diversity. So let's go out and get people for the sake of having diversity. These people may not necessarily be the best representation of what it is we need. And they may not necessarily be the best voices for the community because they don't have that background necessary to be able to speak on behalf of their community or the communities. So there's that sort of component. And then there's also the component surrounding, in Canada specifically, because this question is pertaining to is there anything that you can learn from Canada? In Canada specifically, we had to have a man die by violent police brutality recorded in the USA for us to do something. Before the Black Lives Matter movement took ampler, like really grew powerful this summer, we had two other very international movements, right? So we had in Canada, the Wet'suwet'en crisis, which was this crisis where indigenous people felt that their land was being encroached upon unjustly by an oil and gas company, and there was a lot of police brutality surrounding that, a lot of very interesting government decisions that had inherently negative impacts. And so the entire country was effectively shut down because indigenous people were not allowing trains to pass, they were blocking railways, they were really sort of making their voices known. And then after that, we had the Je ne suis pas un virus movement that started in France that reached frankly the world, which was highlighting how people of Asian descent are being unfairly targeted because of the COVID-19 virus. And once again, as Canada, we stayed silent, even though we saw this massive increase to the point where embassies of South Korea, China, and Thailand were telling their people, hey, heads up, if you're in Canada, be careful when you leave the house. Maybe if you have a white friend, go out with them. And then, Black people have been saying for generations in Canada, there's something wrong, right? We've had articles and books written about being ticketed unfairly. There's really sad stories about a white family who adopted a Black child who had to leave the rural community in Newfoundland because the child was being horribly bullied for the color of his skin, and so they had to move to a more major town. You've got all these sort of things happening, but nothing's happening. And then someone dies in the USA, and all of a sudden Canada's like, right, let's look at racism here. And diversify things, and let's try and diversify things very, very, very quickly. And so now we're seeing people being thrown into very awkward positions where all of a sudden, because they're the one sort of racialized member of their team, they are now the symbol of diversity. And so it's like, what can we do to be anti-racist? And they're sitting there being like, what do I do? And so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Chuck, you mentioned now ideas or activism that are traveling across borders, for example, also via social media. Chris, maybe you can, there's a question from Ulfed Enver, how we better utilize media and social media to fight inequality. You working with young people, is this a tool that you can actually, from a government side, use even more effectively to at least mention different ideas and different ways how to tackle that problem?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think there are a couple of principles that help us move forward. One is in empowering communities. As Chuck was saying, it's one thing to go out and ask people their opinions about things. It's another to hand the pen over and essentially allow the communities themselves to build the plan moving forward. That was one of our big lessons several years ago when we developed our first youth policy. Was, we didn't want this to be a typical government consultation where we went out, asked youth what do they want, and then went back and wrote a policy ourselves and drove it. We added extra steps where we brought youth in then to help us interpret what youth were telling us. And it was a fascinating exercise because what we thought we had heard in the first round was not actually what the youth helping us to interpret what we're saying and say, no, that's not what they're actually telling you. What it really means is this and that approach. And this is a principle I think applies across all policy areas, including into anti-racism. It's about empowering and engaging the communities to help drive the way forward themselves. And that's what we're really trying to do in the approach with our anti-racism strategy, is the investments into Black organizations, into Indigenous organizations, into community-run institutions to help drive the change that needs to be there. So on the digital side, there are many investments that I think can make a big difference in helping disadvantaged youth learn how to code, learn how to control the internet instead of being controlled by it, to drive the message. And it's that shift in power of the government doing for into enabling communities to drive up that I think is a fundamental principle that we need to keep driving forward.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was going to say there are many examples around coding, around entrepreneurship programs, and big investments into helping communities develop where they have been disadvantaged in the past because of the structural racist issues in the way that we have been investing in the past.
There's actually a question from Evelyn Tomazu, which is going in a similar direction. Maybe Juliana can answer it, how can policymakers and other institutions help to develop inclusive initiatives to ensure that minorities have better access to the digital resources? I would like to add to that question, Juliana, what potential do you see in these digital resources actually to help to speak more about anti-racism and policies?
I think it's a really complex issue, the question of digitalization and digital platforms and resources. I think in a one sense it's an opportunity, and I think it's a right. I think we have to see the question of digitalization as a fundamental right. So it's something that we all human beings should be granted all over the world. So as it's access to health, education, we live today in a digitalized world. It's really important that we can adapt. But I think it's much more difficult than that. Then, of course, how can we do? Well, policymakers and institutions, of course, could provide certain programs to bring more digitalization to those who are not at a position to afford or to have access to digital platforms. But it's beyond that. It's also who can have an internet of quality, who can pay for the price of communication, how expensive it is. And the digital world is not different from any other offline world. So it just showcases the same inequalities, but in another platform. So I think it's what is important that policymakers, institutions should take as step number one is really to understand the issue. Is not to bring just a short-term solution, but also understanding that we are not only here to work in the frame of, for example, in the context of COVID, of emergency, but we also should be taking this exercise as an opportunity to let's think one way forward. What does it represent in terms of systemic discrimination, access to rights, racial equality, and also something then is something other like just also something that comes with the digital world, but we have to talk about it. Is also about the question of the bias of the algorithms. So,
Yes.
okay, I have a phone, I can access that, but this can also be a risk and a threat for me. Chuck was just saying, like, you are monitored everywhere. We are already monitored in the offline world. With the bias of the algorithm is a duplication and exacerbation of the surveillance through which we are exposed every day. Going beyond the question of security, even a question of access to servers and, for example, in the field of employment, like today, the algorithm can already exclude you to any job opportunity because they're gonna read you on a bias that categorize you as a unfit candidate. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a catch-22, I would say. So of course we need that to ensure that because we need to see it via the lenses of digital rights as a fundamental right, but we should not stop there. We should also think about how this is interlinked, intersecting with structural inequalities.
Thank you, Juliana. I really liked your thought about understanding the issue. Sometimes it's really, really simple. Last time when I was in the European Parliament, that was like 2 years ago, Samira Rafaela, I again could see that there are a lot of MPs there who did not understand the issue, actually. So my question, how do you deal with so many people? I mean, the European Parliament, you find nationalists, you find white supremacists, you find from across Europe people who really don't like our discussion here, actually. So, as yourself, someone who understands what racism means, how do you deal with these policymakers actually who look in your face and tell you what basically, let's talk about real issues? What do you do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it all starts with having the very strong mindset that you also have the right to be there. And the fact that there are people that don't find you or that don't find the topics that you find important enough, or the fact that they don't understand you, is not a reason for me personally or individually, or for, I believe, every other individual who wants to become a legislator or a politician, to back down from it. I mean, it's a very strong driver for me, a very strong motivation to be there, knowing that these voices are in these institutions, also in the parliament that I'm part of. And it gives me a lot of energy to fight that, because I realize that every time when a political colleague of mine in the European Parliament is making itself guilty of hate speech, for example, then I'm asking myself the question, what if I or others weren't there? What if the situation was even worse, that we weren't there to counter that, to do something against it, you know? And I feel individually responsible to be there and to confront colleagues and voices in the parliament that are making that people in society are being discriminated and excluded and offended. So I think that we also need to, turn it around a little bit here. Persons like me, like you, we have the right to be there and to be part of it. So that's the very first thing that we need to do and realize. And then, the second thing is that use your voice. I mean, they use their voice. I use my voice then. And they want me to listen to them, which is hard. But then they also need to listen to me. And I'm also part of the negotiations. I'm also having that seat at the table. And I feel very supported by a lot of colleagues, luckily, and by my own group, that are very clear that fighting and combating racism is a top priority right now. So I am lucky that I believe now in a time space in the EU and in the European Parliament specifically, that there is a very strong awareness now. And yes, in the beginning, and I think you always have that, it wasn't easy always, indeed, to be the only one often, to come up with a topic or to make an issue out of it. And sometimes that feels very lonely. But, what I just noticed is that so many colleagues now from different backgrounds are very supportive and are also taking up the battle themselves. And that's a very good and positive thing, I believe. But yes, we need a stronger critical mass in our institution to make sure that we counter these opposite voices. And you see it indeed in terms of racism, discrimination, but also sexism, anti-feminist, anti-LGBTI. It's this whole discourse, and that's extremely worrisome. But I do feel strong. I do feel like we're having a strong bloc in the European Parliament that is till today so far effective in countering it. Yeah.
Thank you, Samira, for your perspective. Of course, then the question is, when you negotiate with white supremacists, what could be like a common ground there, actually? But
Well,
Chuck, yeah, I mean,
a common ground?
there's no common ground with someone who is anti-LGBT while you say it's a human right. That's also a part of the problem, maybe.
Yes, indeed. Of course. I mean, yeah, well, the only thing that we have in common is that we are both democratic representatives, That's the only thing we have in common. But I don't have any difficulties with making clear to them that furthermore we don't have any common grounds. I mean, I'm definitely not backing down from that. And I feel often very strong and effective during negotiations that I need to do for the reports that you're reporting on for your group or for the parliament. And again, I can notice that we have a strong progressive bloc in the European Parliament, so that helps. But yes, definitely, I did have experiences with discussions and conflicts with these kind of colleagues that want to take out everything that has to do with race, with ethnic identity, with gender, with LGBTI. Like it's crazy, and it's sometimes unbelievable.
And it sounds exhausting, actually.
It is, but they keep up the fight.
Let me leave Chuck comment, because you raised your hand, Chuck.
Yeah, so this is one of the things I do for a living is educate people on racism, educate government agencies, private organizations, non-for-profits, all that fun stuff. And often the way in which we approach it is to try and approach it from a lens of shared experiences. Because the thing is, this is me being very gentle about it, but the thing is, a lot of people who are very sort of openly sort of racist or homophobic or whatever it is that they've decided to take a very firm stance against and go out of their way to fight against, even if they're not necessarily being impacted by these people getting rights, is that they tend to see them as sort of an enemy to who they are, an enemy in a way that, by you getting these rights, this is the way it impacts our economy or the life or our religion, so we're going to get hellfire or something random like that. And so we found that, you don't necessarily have common ground in the sense of, there's a human rights, and if you're anti them, there's no common ground in that sense. But common ground in the sense that these people tend to be marginalized as well, in some way, shape, or form, whether it is socioeconomically because they are poor, whether it is because they are from a rural area, because people in rural areas, especially in Canada, are very heavily disadvantaged in comparison to people from urban spaces, or whether it is because they are women, because in Canada, white women are a big propagator of racism, but they still do experience oppression as women, or francophones, white francophones. It's been in the media quite a bit how our French majority province has been adamantly refusing to believe that there's such a thing as systemic racism. They're like, absolutely not, we refuse to say that there is. But francophones experience such intense discrimination in Canada, and so often, when you're in your bubble, you create this sort of like tourbillon where you think everyone is against you. And then when we enter into this bubble and we start having these conversations, we start talking about, like, let's talk about the ways in which society has hurt and oppressed you. As a white francophone, these are things that, this is your history in Canada. These are things that you've gone through. As a white woman, these are things that you have gone through in this country. As someone from a rural area who is in a global pandemic shutdown where the government is saying work from home, but you actually don't have access to high-speed internet because of the rural area, and you could have $1 million and still not have access to that high-speed internet because of your physical location, that's ridiculous, and that's oppressive of our society, and it's ignoring the transition that needed to happen long before this happened to make you resilient to these things. And so we have those conversations where we try and create these spaces where they're able to speak about issues that society is presenting upon them. And then at that point, it's like, okay, now imagine all of that, and you were Black. Imagine all of what you're going through, and add on that layer of every issue you've told me has not been related to skin color. And I imagine having a skin color also be one of those issues. And then we start seeing these clicks of recognition where you start realizing, oh, it's not us versus them, but we now need to sort of have a sense of solidarity so that we can collectively change. And so it's not always easy to have these. It requires a lot of patience. It requires a lot of listening, it requires a lot of time, which is why we charge for it. Don't do this for free, people. It's not easy. But, it's, as you make those small changes, you see people impacting their circles, right? You see people getting very upset with their parents for saying something racist to their friend. And they're like, no, mom and dad, this is not the world you grew up in. You don't get to say that. and you see people creating those changes in their social circles, and hopefully creating that sort of larger propagation across society.
We have 10 more minutes. Chris, you are nodding. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
I mean, there's so much that was said already that is fantastic. Just to build on one part about changing attitudes and awareness. So Juliana mentioned that before about the need for better data and disaggregated information, because part of it is trying to make sure we have the right strategies for the right reasons, for the right people in the right places, and you need information for that. But as you've very correctly said before, it's not just about the empirical data, it's about the contextual data as well, and how people feel. And that is a very key part, not just the hard data in this as well. And as Chuck was saying before too, it's about working, continuing the push to change the attitudes. And while the internet might be a very, very ugly place in many instances now, it has the power to be such a powerful tool. And when we talk to youth, they don't talk about the discrimination that they see, although we certainly see it. They talk about the potential that it is for them to get a job, to get ahead, to become part of their own change and approach. And really, I think the opportunity of a digital world is so tremendous in helping to change this.
Juliana, I was wondering, do you have also some ideas of how to talk to privileged people, how to talk to how to talk to the so-called Karen, so she stops calling the police on Black people? Do you have any strategy, digitally or not digitally, that you can share with us in the last 8 minutes, of course?
I only have one: make them feel uncomfortable. That's all. A shift in the societies, these revolutions, they become with friction. As you know, I'm not European, and one of the greatest writers from where I'm born, he has written a book called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire, in which he explains exactly that there is a need to have a kind of movement, and that we take action and we claim the space in order to bring a certain feeling of movement, that we are moving towards something. And I think that put people in a very uncomfortable position is something that we have to do. As a Black person, that's why I admire the work of Chuck as an educator as well. Especially 2020 is a question like, as Black people, sometimes I'm also tired of educating people all the time. I think this is also the burden that racism puts on us. So that we are those that are victimized, and we are those who have to teach how to not do it without no check his joking that, yeah, and nobody even cares and don't listen to us. So for me, it's really honest and individual and simple decisions. We have to have these uncomfortable conversations. There was a question before about the role of media and social media. Yeah, that's it. Again, I'm not a communication expert, nor a campaigning expert, but I do use campaign and communication as a tool for advocacy and lobby. In my point of view, I think media can be also, again, a opportunity and a threat. The same lack of representation that we have in the public spaces, we also have in the media space. So we also need to claim and bring more diversity, but not tokenism, like Chuck was saying, really bring diversity in representation, but in policies to retain people of color, journalists, and also community-led media as reference. I don't know if you know, but every year more and more community-led medias are closed, shut down, either by government or because by lack of financement. So who has the voice? Only the mainstream media that is owned by big white rich families, and then create this narrative. I have a problem with the question of the narrative, because it creates this feeling from the old magic bullet theory from the 30s that if you shoot a message, everybody's going to understand the same way, and then this will bring a social behavior. And I think changing a narrative is more complex than that. It's about the different backgrounds, it's about the education that you have, it's about access to information, who has access to different platforms of information. It's about create critical thinkers in a democratic space. So I think the question of hate speech on social media should begin first with a better regulation of the content, not only the removal of the content, but also what happens on the offline. We cannot also always find a solution for hate speech online on the online platform. This needs to be brought to the offline. We need to bring some complaints, formal complaints. I don't know how's it in Canada, but in the European Union, the transition from the online to the offline complaints are very low. Like the rates are very low. So we need to bring more complaints to the court. And I think as well, more regulation. And I also think more understanding. So I have seen the most hatred speech never been blocked from social media. And I have seen very tolerant discussions around sometimes the word race or homophobia being removed immediately without any kind of technical screening. So I think we need better methodologies on how to address that. And I think regulation could be also a solution.
Yes, and I would like to add.
Yeah, go ahead. 1 minute for each one, because we don't have a lot of time left.
Yeah, on the regulation part, you know, the role of big tech here is extremely crucial. And what I believe now is what you see is that big tech is extremely powerful, also in terms of data, the data sets that they use, that they apply, also in terms of who's in charge of the data. And they have a major responsibility, I believe, to counter hate speech on social media. And they should also definitely be more transparent on how, for example, algorithms work, how they use it, how they apply it. I mean, I do believe that there is a lack of transparency and a lack of accountability also coming from big tech. So I'm glad to see that within the European Commission, there's now a lot of work been done also on a framework on artificial intelligence. And in 2016, actually, the European Commission agreed with Facebook, Microsoft, Twitter, YouTube, the so-called code conduct on countering illegal hate speech online. So you see that more and more social media platforms are also now being part of that kind of agreement. But we do see, given the numbers, that we need more improvement in terms of monitoring it, in terms of really deleting it, and also finding it very quickly on social media. So the last evaluation actually shows that there was an average. The companies are involved flagged now 90% of the content within 24 hours, and 71% of the content deemed illegal hate speech is removed. So, but still we see that users want to have a more responsible and quicker response, and that is something also that we need to work on from the European Union.
Chuck, you wanted to comment? You have 45 seconds. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the cultural aspect. So I think we also have to sort of keep in mind where a lot of social media comes from. So a lot of social media was created by organizations based in the USA. So they have that mindset of freedom of speech, and they're very reluctant to remove things because people in the US especially tend to call out that. And so as social media has become this very sort of large, almost quote unquote lawless world, we still have to recognize countries need to figure out what is a digital jurisdiction. And they need to figure that out, because if someone is, using their gun rights in the US and they try and cross over to Canada, that gun will be seized and it will be taken away from them because we have different laws surrounding that. So it's the same thing with sort of hate speech and speech in general. Is in Canada we have freedom of expression, but not necessarily freedom of speech, which tends to function a little bit differently. So when I see people on social media screaming, "But my freedom of speech," and Twitter can't remove my freedom of speech, and X, Y, Z, it's forgetting that jurisdictional component. And so, I'm super happy to see what the EU is doing. And I think in Canada, we need to be a little bit braver in saying, we need to see this. I mean, Canada has done that for languages. We saw with Netflix, for example, Canada was very much like, you need to have this amount of Canadian content, this amount of French content. We want to see that same thing in regards to hate speech as well, as sort of creating those digital boundaries and saying, if you're on Canadian Twitter, if you're on Canadian Facebook, Canadian YouTube, you are following the laws of Canada, and that speech is unacceptable in this country. And so it's sort of really figuring that out. And our government is a little bit, no offense, a little bit slow in jumping into that switch into a digital world and figuring out where the jurisdiction lies and what laws would be effective in countering that and establishing, sort of Canadian sovereignty in digital spaces.
Thank you, Chuck, so much. Thank you. That's our time for today. So many still open questions, but it's a conversation which is not ending now because we don't have any time anymore for this talk. Thank you so much for your perspectives, for your work, and I hope to continue actually the conversation with all of you in different spaces digitally, or hopefully in one day soon also in person. So thank you, everybody, and let's keep in touch. Thanks.
Auf Wiedersehen.